Welcome to Echoes of History, the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm your host, Matt Lewis. You're joining us as we dive deep into the heart of an era that has shaped legends and popular culture for centuries. In case you haven't seen it, the world premiere trailer for Assassin's Creed Shadows has been released, and we can see that it transports us to feudal Japan. This is a time renowned for its samurai and ninjas, a time bursting with history, culture, and stories. And for the past few episodes, we've been exploring some of this fascinating period. So far, our journey's taken us back in time to the upheavals of the Sengoku period, as the seeds for the unification of Japan are being sown. We've travelled to the heart of Imperial Japan, then the city of Kyoto, and we've met some of the key characters that defined this age. Today, we invite you to imagine what daily life might have been like in feudal Japan. In Assassin's Creed Shadows, we'll meet a whole host of characters, including merchants, farmers, as well as legendary warriors. What would the average day have looked like for someone who was a farmer, a merchant, or maybe even a samurai? And what would they have dressed like? What would they do for fun? And what does all of this tell us about the social categories of the time? I'm joined by Kate Kitagawa, author and historian of mathematics. Kate currently works for the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency as Senior Counselor for International Relations. She's also a former teacher at Harvard University of the history of medieval Japan. And this is the period we've invited Kate onto Echoes of History to talk about. Today, we ask Kate to shed some light on the different people that made up Japanese society. People we'll meet in Assassin's Creed Shadows, and how the ever-shifting political landscape of the 16th century shaped Japanese society and culture, paving the way towards unification. Welcome to Echoes of History, Kate.
Thank you very much for having me today, Matt. Good to see you.
I'm really excited to get into this episode about kind of everyday life in Japan. How would we fit in if we found ourselves in feudal Japan as players of Assassin's Creed Shadows are about to? So if we're in the Sengoku period in Japan, who do you think you'd be, Kate? Are we peasant farmers? Are we merchants? I mean, obviously, I'm the most legendary samurai of all time. That's how I imagine myself in feudal Japan. But where do you see yourself?
I also like to be a strong samurai because that's probably the high chance of survival. And I probably would enjoy the most about the country life, so that maybe like peasants in the countryside would be my second choice. But I would go with your scenario. Maybe we both become the strong samurai.
I think we would make a fantastic team, and we would almost definitely take feudal Japan by storm, Kate. So how then is feudal society in Japan set up? Is there a class system similar to what we might recognise in the UK? You know, we have our class system. Is there that kind of categorisation to society?
Right. So the most famous categorization that we know of now started sometime in the 17th century. So it was something like a pyramid. There's the strong samurai known as shogun. It will be ruling, always the country. But also there was an emperor. So this is like a high class, just very few people at the top. And then there will be samurai class, the people with sword, and they have the great fighting skills and so on. And then below that, there will be farmers, and then artisans and merchants. So those people were in a hierarchy, like a pyramid. And it has been known as class system, so installed strongly during the 17th century. But before that, there are long history of a samurai ruling. And then back then, especially the time we call Sengoku, that's the time of wars, those class systems were not really rigid. So people were moving more freely between the classes. Also, they would be fighting against each other. So the systems was not really working until the 17th century. So if we go back to a beginning, then we could probably imagine us being a strong samurai, and then there will be the clans around us to help us out, and they will rule the regions. And then sometimes when we get into trouble, we must fight. But then, those kind of systems are strongly becoming more structural, leading up to the feudal, society in the 17th and 18th century.
I'm quite interested that when you listed that structure of society, farmers came above artisans and merchants. And I think in lots of Western cultures, it's possibly the other way around, that we would consider the farmers to be beneath the artisans and the merchants. Is that quite an unusual thing for Japan, that farmers were considered higher in the social ranking than merchants and artisans?
Right. So merchants are at the bottom and then farmers are above them. So what happens to that structure is to praise farmers' work even more and then to suppress the wrongdoings of merchants, because merchants having like lots of money and they have skills to, have the commercial activities going on. If they are like higher up near samurai, then there will be a high chance of having a conflict between them. So they decided that merchants to be at the bottom so that they have like less respect regarding the social class, but then they'll still be able to do commerce and also a lot of money lending and all other activities that let the society move forward.
Interesting. So the idea that they could become wealthy and powerful is counteracted by giving them much less status within society to stop them being a threat to the ruling samurai classes. What kind of jobs and what kind of crafts would people in feudal Japan have been engaged in? So we obviously have the farmers who are working the land, but what other jobs and crafts are available?
Right. Well, maybe one important thing is the sword makers, because, those swords and also all other armors, it has to be very strong and, prestigious and expensive. So those are the professionals that will make only swords for life, or only like armors for life. So those people are really succeeding their businesses over generations. In other businesses, unfortunately, there is a marginalized class that they dealt with, like say butchering and also like some sort of dirty work, so that they are isolated from the mainstream society. And they have been recognized as like a specialized group, but also some sort of prejudice over this group. Those are different sorts of jobs that we recognize in history.
It's interesting how some jobs can end up being viewed that way when they tend to also be vital to the economy. If it's butchering, people want the animals to eat, they want the food, but they don't want to think about how it's arrived there. And there's some sense of a lack of desirability around the process of doing it, but somebody has to do it.
Right. So that's very unfortunate in a way. And also from the time that we respect the farmers, that we hope that we respect all those people who would be engaged in those work that's necessary to our life. But, it wasn't the case. But also one theory is about the blood being so impure. So, for example, the butchering is involving with the blood and also like the taking life. That's really something that Buddhism disrespect, for example. So in that regard, those people had to be doing the work in the darkness or in the dark in a way. That's why, there are some people who are a little bit treated differently from the beginning. You're right that we would hope that those people would have gained much respect over time.
And how did the relationships work between some of those social classes? So we have a feudal system. How does land ownership work? If I'm a farmer, I'm quite well respected. Do I own my own land, or do I hold that from someone who is socially superior to me?
Right. That depends on the time. So the earlier times, when imagine like long time ago, say 12th century and 13th century, land has still been like not registered, right? So that you have to claim the ownership and you have to be gaining approval from someone that has a power over the region. So around that time, the ownership has been decided between your landlord and yourself. And your work will be defined between you two. But then when it becomes more complicated, the society evolves and then like commercial activities going on, and then there will become more registration of the land, and that becomes more systematic than before. So over the time, because that personal bonding was stronger at the beginning, loyalty, for example. Like you have to be loyal to your landmaster or even the master himself. And then that becomes like beginning of how honoring the land becoming a part of the samurai's work. So it has a little bit of evolution from the old times. And then now, as you can imagine, that feudal society was known for having a good working land ownership between the owners, like rulers, and the farmers or the samurai.
Was there much movement between those social classes? Could someone who was born a farmer, could they rise through the ranks and become a daimyo or a local ruler of any kind? Or were things much more strictly controlled in terms of the levels of society?
Strictly controlled. So unfortunately, there are not like sudden moves between the classes. So usually, farmers being registered as farmers, and then they will be farmers forever. So back then, during the Sengoku period, when the class systems were not really rigid, then back then, those are people who had the sword recognized as samurai. Then the people who did not have the sword were peasants. So those like two types to begin with. And then at one point that, this separation started to happen, and then there is almost no point of return. So since then, the guys were the family and also the clans that started to have no training in martial arts, meaning they have the swords and weapons. They become the samurai. And then the rest, it's always been fixed since the 17th century onward.
And do we see that changing and being settled during the Sengoku period? So while all of this warring state period is going on, is that upheaval also affecting the social structures of Japanese society? Is it helping to free them up or is it helping to tighten them up?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think it worked both ways. So first of all, the samurai will have to decide their own sort of structure, right, of the samurai, who's at the top and who will be supporters and who will be the helpers and so on. So around that time, it was more like, this making a system. But at the same time, as I said, the peasant, they could still become the samurai at that time because no registrations, no central authority and so on. So there are like massive dynamics going on. And at the same time, the rulers are deciding who will become stronger than whom and if who will own more land than whom. So they're like both going on. That's like an interesting features of the Sengoku period.
And if we're aspiring samurai, we're going to find our sword maker, we're going to find our armor maker, and you and I are going to take feudal Japan by storm, Kate. But while we're preparing to do that, where are we living? What do houses look like during this period in the countryside and in the towns?
Right. They're very simple. So the countryside and towns, so they had the simple structure of just a roof and then some basic structures. And sometimes if somebody decides to, say, have a fish market or some sort of market in front of their house, and then that's an origin of merchants class. But then they did have those decorations on the facade, and then they will have something to sell in front of their houses. So that's a very basic structure. But for the higher classes, they had some sort of symbolization by building the tall castles, for example. That's like very visible sign of power. So the castle, it has to have the structure of visible strategy. So sometimes, the sea or sort of canal surrounding it. So it's not just a tower, because if just a tower, then somebody will come and knock this out. So that's not great. So they have to show some sort of wisdom of having the barricade and wisely decorated on the side of the castle. And then it has to be tall so that they can see or oversee the whole town and so on. So the house for the samurai becomes those inner quarter of structure, let's say castle keep. So then they would have some sort of, symbolized lifestyle that the ruler would have. Also, there is a special structure related to the house is the tea house. You might have heard about the samurai practicing the tea ceremony, for example. And then tea ceremony has been done in a small room, and it's usually decorated specially for this, but decoration has to be very simple. So it's not like much of decoration having the items all over, but it's very simple. And then it has a structure representing the calmness and representing its own sort of traditions and so on. And sometimes the flowers, just having that little flower display, that would help also to show how this, simple space would speak. So this tea house is not higher up in a castle, but it's usually separated, and then sometimes even in a mountainside. So those are the structures that's probably unique to the Japanese samurai society.
And who would live in a family home? Did the Japanese people during this period keep extended families close to home, or did they tend to sort of move out of home quite early?
Right, interesting question. So the merchants, or those people who started to sell specialized goods, they will be passing this business to the next generations. That means the family will stay closer together necessarily, so that usually the main house will have the first son and the second son and then the third son somewhere in the region. And then the business will just keep on going until the next one will find the successor. And then the next one will find the next successor, and so on. This structure let the family become very close. And then family structure of the samurai as well, that they will have to be tight group. They have to be bonded very strongly, especially when they become massive force. Then they can't really have an internal conflict. Ideally not, right? So they will have to have those structures, and then the relatives will become the close vassals, for example, so that they will all live somewhere close. So imagine there is the castle, the ruler will be at the top, and then they will have the village of the relatives and also close vassals, so like related clans. So they all live at one place. And then this is like a merchant group living and then selling the specialized goods to all the people, including the samurai. So the structure of the town started to become, more categorized. And then also samurai's region, like this is a samurai village, and this is merchants, markets and so on. So those started to become more visible as the class structure started to become fixed.
And one of the other things I'd like to talk a little bit about is what you and I might have worn if we found ourselves in Sengoku, Japan. I guess for women, we associate the kimono perhaps most closely with Japanese society. Is that what most women would have worn, or is that unusual?
Oh, it is usual formal clothing. So the kimono is the thing that the woman would wear. And also for men as well, they would wear kimono, but in a different sort of style and made. So the kimono usually has clothings, across the sleeves, in front of you. And we both look at men and women wearing the same style, and with this family crest sometimes here and there around the neck. So you can see on the kimono which clan that you belong to and like what kind of class that you are associated with. So the kimono is not just beautiful, but the quality and also the patterns that will make all the people stand out. And also patterns too. They wore cotton, but also like kimono style make, so that, made is the same, so they will look like, they are wearing the same style of clothing.
So were the styles between sort of the upper and lower classes less about different shapes and styles of clothing and just more to do with the quality and the flamboyance and the flashiness of it?
So when I looked at these folding screens made in the beginning of 17th century, they are depiction of women. So the high class woman had umbrella, and also she wore a hat. So that would be a huge difference that it makes, because in the lower class women, they will wear kimono in a similar style, just a low quality, but they will not usually have an umbrella and so on. So there will be a great difference that you can see even on the folding screens from the time of their living.
You and I are going to look amazing when we take over feudal Japan, Kate. We're going to have the best swords and we're going to look absolutely fantastic.
Right. Yeah, I would love to do this. And hopefully without violence too. So that's something that I focus on in my research, because, back then that was the only choice that those strong allied samurai would take over. And then that did happen, we have to admit. But nowadays we like to give up the sword. So Matt with your virtue, and then me, Kate, being like, say, kind person, then we can make a great team to have a good influence to the world. And then back then, it just started to become obvious about the muscle power, about swords and then killing and so on. But at the same time, women realized the importance of nonviolence as well. So the nonviolent part, that's about women, say, having the writing skill. So, women write to other people, passing through the message. And then that message become the clear information that's been certified by the sender. And then that was very important in the chaotic world, that you need a very good writing to convey the information or will to pass on. So, writing skill, it's non-violent, but it becomes also another tool to make promises. So once we become the rulers, we would like to make rules, and then somebody has to write about it. And then women really helped, and the woman educated children and so on. So with those powers of nonviolence that they started to create the better condition in the society, I think we need to really emphasize that aspect of the rulership as well.
Have you ever wondered if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually real? Or what made Alexander so great? Join me, Tristan Hughes, twice a week, every week on the Ancients from History Hit, where I'm joined by leading academics, best-selling authors, and world-class archaeologists to shine a light on some of ancient history's most fascinating questions, like who built Stonehenge and why? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls and why are they so valuable? And were the Spartan warriors really as formidable as the history books say? Join me, Tristan Hughes, twice a week, every week on the Ancients from History Hit, wherever you get your podcasts.
In what other ways would being a woman in feudal Japan have influenced your life during the period there? I mean, I guess, I'm much more focused on medieval European society where women were treated very badly, kind of set to one side, often marginalised. But we do know that they operated this really soft power, which is similar to what you're talking about women doing in Japan. But in what other ways would being a woman make your life different from that of a man?
Right. So women started to become financially independent during the Sengoku time. So that's something different from other societies. The other societies, why the women stayed, in a sort of like a second class, is that financially they will have to be dependent on their father or their husbands or even their sons. Then around the time of the unification of Japan, the Japanese women started to have the financial independence as one of the quality of life that they will have to sustain. So that sometimes even the father died or husband died or any relatives died, that they themselves can live. So, it's like a starting point of having like a little bit of equality, a little bit of more rights in a society by claiming her own like land or financial assets and so on. So I think they started to realize also about this getting into the financial transaction that has made a great impact to the samurai world. It's not only men that could own the lands and wealth.
Do you think women in medieval and early modern Japan had it better than women in medieval and early modern Europe? They seem like they had more independent power and authority and possibly more respect.
Right. Well, I've been reading women's stories from all over the world. And I think, some people really exerted their wills and powers and also wishes and so on. So it might be really depending on the one's agency, like what they want to do with their lives. But in general, maybe the Japanese woman would have a little more equal right to men than the women in a medieval Europe, on average, I must say.
So one of the other things we would need to do to fit in feudal Japan is to be able to find food for ourselves. We need to be able to eat. So players in the game, they're trying to meld into feudal Japan and to pass for part of society. So if we were looking for a meal in Sengoku Japan, what kind of food might we be eating? And is that different depending on our class?
Right. Usually the basic food are the same. So the special food, like, seasonal ones or very expensive ones, those are consumed by the samurais and then ruling classes. But the very basic things, like say rice and grains mixed with fish and salted plums and all other nutritious fruits. I think those are the very basic things that everyone sort of shared in the society. So they used to eat twice per day. So one is obviously sometime like around breakfast, and then they will have another meal at night. And meal itself, as I said, will be simple, like say miso soup. There's a soup that comes with the grain, and then those salted, because preservatives almost always salt. So the salted fish, salted pickles, and then other things comes with it. And then soup and then grain, and then those combination are the basics. And then some unusual seasonal food, like, the fish that only comes into this season, or some sort of chestnuts, that's like really delicious, not just the dessert aspect of it, but it's more like seasonal aspect that they enjoy a lot. And then also some wealthy people will drink sake. So the sake has become a good item for the men to hang out together, and then they are enjoying the sake. And the lower class too, depending on like how rich and how poor, but they basically had an access to those drinks. So the varieties of drinks available for them.
Do you think food at this time would have been nice? Would you have liked to live on the diet of feudal Japan?
I've been hearing a lot about the balanced diet back then being so good. So sometimes when we go on diet, for example, we would like to shape up a little bit, say -2-3 kilos, that we look back and say, look, this is miso soup and then grain and then some pickles, and then just salt is important for our bodies. So that's like a basics that keep us going, right? So I think still the good part of wisdom that coming from the basic food from long time ago, sort of alive, in our lives as well.
Yeah, and I guess, in a world of ultra-processed food, we're talking about stuff that was really good for you and full of nutrition. But I really feel like I would have struggled with the 2 meals a day as a greedy man. I like my 3 meals a day. I feel like 2 would not be enough for me. And obviously you and I, we're now busy taking over Japan. Mm-hmm. What would we do if we wanted to relax? Were there games in medieval Japan that we know about?
Right. One thing that the samurai ruler, especially the unifier Toyotomi Hideyoshi, liked was the no play. So there are theaters all over Japan. That time theater is actual place, like a stage, and then there will be some players. And it's even sort of 3D, because imagine that there are some walls around this stage. And then on this side, like right side, that can be used for one scene. And then it moves to the second part, to the front of the stage. And, the third part, again, like it comes back on the stage, and then fourth part moves on to the left-hand side. So those are really clever sort of 3D theater that they had. And then that's very joyous to watch. And at the same time, the samurai like to even play by themselves, so that they could play the role of person A, showing up at these scenes and so on. So that becomes more sort of a intellectual exercise combined with the games and joy. So I think that no play is really a good feature of that time. Also, chess. Many people still play chess, and they're really fascinating game. So similar to chess, Japan had Go. So that's like a black and then white sort of stones been on a table, and then they play like chess. So they did have those things at that time, even like, the merchant class and then artisans class, they enjoy that as well. From long time ago, Japanese people like the haiku poems. So the haiku has a longer version that can be saying like, so I will say first part, and then Matt will continue. And then I will reply, depending on what Matt started to create. Could be the story that I will continue. It could be a reply to what you have said. So those kind of wordplay that always been culture, really interesting and in long, standing culture of Japan.
Amazing. It sounds like a medieval haiku rap battle that we could get engaged in.
Right. That's right. Yes.
And I guess one of the other things that we associate quite closely with Japan is sumo. When does sumo emerge as a sport? And is that something that people would go and watch as a big group? Is that a community activity to go and watch sumo?
So I don't know exactly when that started, but I remember there is also a screen that's writing sumo wrestling scenes of, I think that was Rabbit and a Frog. So the Rabbit and the Frog playing the sumo coming from sometimes say around 12th century. That's been a really long time ago. So it dates back as long as the feudal Japan's starting point, of the samurai rulership. The sumo has been there for entire time of Japanese samurai culture.
And were there big religious festivals as well? We have bank holidays in the UK. Would there be days when everyone had the day off work to engage in a community celebration of some kind?
So there are many celebrations. So at the emperor's, say, court, there's a court system that emperor and then the other courtiers live. They have this calendar of events. So the calendars of events depend on, like, say, in May, you will do this, like bank holidays, as you said. So May, we will have this celebration. June, we have this celebration. So those seasonal events has been always recorded in the diary of courtiers. And similar to that, farmers, depending on the harvest, right? So they will have the big festival to pray for like huge, good, grain, gaining this year and so on. So those kind of festivals also available. And for samurai, there are many different kinds. So one kind is similar to this emperor side. So it's like a high culture. So they will adopt the seasonal events like taken into their regions, and then they will do their own version of it. But at the same time, sometimes just to worship the dead or ancestors, that they had special occasions to sort of pray and then give some offerings at the events and so on. So the samurai class was more combining this high culture and also the religious side of the ceremonies altogether. So there are varieties of the events that's happening, and also it's a class specific as well.
I mean, it's been fascinating to try to understand better the social structures, the way that Japan worked, the kind of food that people would eat, what you might have worn to try and fit in and blend in. But for most people during the Sengoku period, would they have been aware of the high politics and the war and the struggles that are going on? Or are we talking about, most of the population would still be farming and just trying to get the crops in every year and not really engaging too much with the politics that's going on? Would it have affected everybody's daily lives, or would it have been really an issue of the upper classes fighting with each other?
Okay, that's really interesting question. So, say first segment of the samurai rule. The samurai's so-called headquarters was in Kamakura. That's current day Kamakura city near Tokyo. So the Tokyo city was not known at the time that Tokyo was a city yet, but the Kamakura was not known nationwide. So when the Kamakura rulership was going on and being consolidated, it's not that many people would know about the politics. So it's like, say, regional understandings of this is where shogun lives, and this is what shogun does. And then in Kyoto, there is an emperor and has been residing all the time. So the Kyoto people, like residents, will be more aware of what's happening around the courtiers and so on. So around the first sort of segment of time, the very first samurai rules, I would say that not so many people would know about the politics. That will continue the middle segments of the samurai rule that we call usually medieval Japan. And in medieval Japan as well, this Kamakura headquarters of the samurai has been moved and taken by a different family. And then the samurai headquarters became the Kyoto as well. So in Kyoto, the dual structure of this courtier's emperor's house and the shogunate. So the Kyoto people will be really subject to what political moves are. But other people, like say around outside of Kyoto, they will be happily living in their regions, and then they will have those like farming going on, and they would have rather stable time so they could enjoy. And around the time, the clear cut was this big war called Oni War. So that's 1467, so like mid 15th century. And then since that time, I say 150 years, it would be chaotic time of war. So, the political system was collapsing and then people will be seeing the fights all over. And as I said, the class system was not rigid yet. So people could take up the weapons so easily. So that taking up the weapons so easily, meaning that they will have to know what's going on in the politics. So this 150 years of fighting, and not only the samurai, but so many people nationwide would know about what's going on at the top level. And then afterwards, this peaceful sort of ruling started to happen by the shogunate Tokugawa. So that's 17th century and onward. So the class system is becoming more rigid. And then people are becoming very calm and also practicing their own religions. And it's not all about so happy every day, but here's things compared to other times like Sengoku Japan or those 150 years that people had less affected by the politics. So those are some sort of sequence of the time that, people were interested or involved in politics.
Yeah, so in terms of Assassin's Creed Shadows, when players are in Japan in this Sengoku period, they are in a time when people are really heightened and aware that there is civil war, there is politics, there is things going on all over the place. It almost is getting into every aspect of everybody's life all throughout Japan. So you're in a place that is on heightened alert, if you like.
That's right.
And I guess the last question I have then, so I would undoubtedly, as much as I would like to think of myself as the greatest samurai of all time, if I were in feudal Japan, I'd probably be rubbish. I'd really struggle with 2 meals a day. I'd probably faint. How do you think you would have fared? Could you have lived in Sengoku Japan?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I think I will secretly eat the third meal. That's probably the point to survive, if I could be wealthy enough. But I think the Sengoku Japan was very critical that people thought about the system, how the human has to be living, what the meanings of the family, love, and life itself. So I think, that was a time that people really lived. Even the short time, there are some unfortunate incidences of death and so on. But I think the Sengoku time that I really cherish as a historian. And if I were there at that time, that I would probably had life that I would be convinced that I lived.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's such an important part of Japanese history and culture. If I could steal that third meal, and if you and I could find decent sword makers, I feel like we could take Japan, or at least we could have a go.
That's right.
We could be the most legendary samurai together. Okay, that's been absolutely fascinating. I hope that's given people an idea of what it might be like to be on the ground in feudal Japan, the buildings you're going to see, the people you're going to encounter, the food you're going to have to eat, and the way that you're going to have to live your life to fit into feudal Japan. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us to share all of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. Next time, we leave feudal Japan and head to a different world from the Assassin's Creed universe, Victorian London, to meet the person who gave that era its name, Queen Victoria. So join us for the next episode to find out more about the history behind the world of Assassin's Creed.